Hi everyone. Before we begin, we would just like to give a shout out to the sponsor of this episode, Best Fiends. Our episodes deal with serious and often distressing incidents. Listener discretion is advised. The town of Coatbridge was no stranger to cold weather, but on February 23, 1957, the snow fell especially heavy, with a blizzard attacking the town's tenements from all directions. In one of those tenements lived a grandmother recuperating from Asian flu, a pandemic that was then sweeping the globe. At home with her was her son Jim, who'd arrived with fish to cook for their dinner, and shortly after, at around 4 p.m, the small figure of her 11-year-old granddaughter, Moira, appeared in the doorway after battling her way through the snow. Dressed in her usual warm clothing, a navy blue school coat and a pixie hat adorned with red ribbons, she was her usual talkative self. It was already dark outside, and she hurried in, chilled to the bone and eager for the warmth of her granny's home. She was also looking forward to the fish supper her Uncle Jim had offered, but there was one problem. There was no butter in which to fry the fish, meaning one of them would have to walk up to the local co-op shop to buy some. Being as helpful as ever, Moira was happy to make the short journey to Laird Street from Muirhall Street, and her grandmother and uncle thought nothing of sending her off with some loose change for the butter. If she walked quickly, she could make it to the shop before it closed at 4:15 p.m. However, it would be years until it was discovered that Moira had an ulterior motive for offering to go buy the butter. The following day, on February 24, it was to be her mother's birthday, and she planned on surprising her with a birthday card. To do this, she would have to sneak into town on a bus to the nearest Woolworths store to buy one. As she made her way out the door that day, with the promise of hurrying back with the butter, she thought that perhaps she could maybe also get away with travelling the short bus journey into town undetected. She had meant no harm in what she was doing, and there was no malice in wanting to surprise her mother with a birthday card. Yet the innocent gesture of sneaking to Woolworths on that late, dark, snowy afternoon would prove to be a fatal mistake. After she buttoned up her coat and waved goodbye to her grandmother, she vowed to be back soon. She was never seen again.
I'm Jess, and this is Skinwalker.
Moira Anderson made an impression on everyone who met her. Not only was she pretty, with straight blonde hair that framed elfin features, she had dazzling blue eyes and a cheeky smile. She also had a strong personality. Some would say too strong for a little girl. Her uncles would say she was so tough she should have been born a boy, and indeed she could compete at games like marbles, known locally as bulls, with all the boys and beat them every time. She had no time for dolls or skipping rope like other girls in her neighbourhood, but instead preferred to act the tomboy and perform magic tricks. For a girl her age, she was staggeringly intelligent, lovably cheeky, and known for having an answer for everything. It wasn't that she was badly behaved, far from it, but she was certainly a handful and always bounding with energy. As the Second World War ended, she was born in Coatbridge, a town in Lanarkshire, 8 miles east of Glasgow. Today, it's a small yet growing town, with a population of over 40,000. However, back in the 1950s, it would have been much smaller, more rural, and for the residents, would have felt to be 1,000,000 miles from the bustling city of Glasgow. With its history rooted in industry, the Coatbridge skyline was dominated by the looming shapes of large blast furnaces, which gave rise to the town's nickname, the Iron Borough. Like every town, it had its good areas where wealthier residents lived. These were charmed places where the livery boys could be seen cycling down the street in their long aprons, weighed down with packaged groceries on their way to families who would no doubt tip them well for their service. At the other end of town, working class families bought their groceries from poorly lit shops with sawdust covered floors and stern faced assistants who cut and packed products by hand. Local children would be sent to collect shopping, known locally as messages, and played freely in the streets. For many, life in Coatbridge was not rich or exciting, but it was certainly safe, especially for the youngsters. Crime was rare, and the local newspaper covered stories with not so scandalous headlines such as "Butcher fined for having too much fat in his mince." For the children of Coatbridge during that blustery winter of 1957, life was perfect, innocent, almost idyllic. Yet, the bubble of safety would burst on the night of Moira's disappearance. When she didn't return to her grandmother's home with the promised butter, her uncle's first impulse was to become angry. He complained that she said she wouldn't be long. As the minutes ticked by on the clock, he stated, "I bet she's playing bloody bulls with those boys again." It wasn't an unfair assumption, given that she often couldn't resist a quick game of marbles. Her Uncle Jim, growing increasingly irate, watched the clock as he waited for her to return with a smile on her face, a pack of butter, and her pocket full of marbles she'd won off the local boys. But as afternoon turned to night, his anger soon turned to anxiety. Later on that evening, she was supposed to be meeting with her cousins to go to the local cinema, the Regal, so Jim asked them if they had seen her. Perhaps she had wandered off early to meet them. They said they would look out for her, but she was nowhere to be seen, although they didn't worry too much. They couldn't for a moment believe that something bad had happened to Moira, only that she was maybe up to mischief somewhere. They were in for a surprise when they returned home from the cinema to find Moira's father at their house. He was looking everywhere for his daughter and had hoped she was with them. To his horror, her cousins had not seen her, and they were just as perplexed as him as to her whereabouts. Moira's father was stunned. The journey from her grandmother's house to the Co-op was only 500 yards. What was taking her so long? Moira's family could only hope that she would turn up sooner or later, but when this failed to happen, their panic grew. The hours passed and still there was no sign of her. Then night faded and a new day dawned. Still, she hadn't shown up. They could only assume that something terrible happened to her. Gradually, news of her disappearance began to slowly make its way around Coatbridge. A local newspaper ran the enigmatic headline, "Something made Moira change her mind about shopping." But as to what this could be was anybody's guess. Things were looking bleak for the Anderson family, but unfortunately for them, they were to suffer another terrible tragedy. A few days after Moira had disappeared, her grandfather died. His funeral came and went, but Moira's whereabouts were still unknown. It was as though she had simply vanished into thin air. People gossiped about where she could have been. Locals asked the questions. Had she run away? Was she in trouble? Was she playing a terribly cruel prank? Or had she even come to harm? The abduction of a child was simply unthinkable in such a small town at such an innocent time. At that point, only one other child had been abducted in the history of Coatbridge. A young boy kidnapped during the 1920s, but locals struggled to believe that is what had happened to Moira. People were baffled and utterly confused as to what happened to her, while her family were plunged into panic and despair. Still, her mother Maisie didn't give up hope on finding her. Moira's birthday was approaching on March 31, and Maisie went out and bought her the game of Monopoly she had wanted for some time. Somehow, she hoped and prayed that her daughter would return home to receive her birthday gift. Coincidentally, Moira's birthday that year fell on Mothering Sunday, and Maisie hoped that if Moira didn't come home for her birthday, she would return to see her mother. But the game of Monopoly remained untouched, and Mother's Day went uncelebrated. Strangely, at this time, the police paid little interest to Moira's disappearance, and no door-to-door inquiries took place. This seems inconceivable today, and although it seemed odd back in 1957 too, it wasn't questioned. Small town life was private, and although people might have gossiped behind closed doors, they weren't in the habit of overly interfering in people's lives. Meanwhile, people simply couldn't wrap their heads around the idea that a crime could have been committed against Moira. Surely she would turn up eventually, because little girls in Coatbridge couldn't come to any harm, could they? As the disappearance of Moira lingered over the town, 8-year-old Sandra Brown lived in nearby Dunbeth Road. She knew Moira loosely, but the 3-year age gap between them meant they seldom came into contact with one another. Sandra knew all about what terrible things could be done to little girls, because for as long as she could remember, she had been living in her own personal hell at the hands of her father, Alexander Garcia. Violent and domineering, he punished little Sandra and took glee in manipulating his family. Waiting until her mother Mary had her back turned, he'd rest a tablespoon in hot tea before pressing it to Sandra's bare leg or arm until her skin blistered. He stated to Sandra's mother, "She's so careless, always spilling tea." He would laugh as he'd blow up a paper bag and burst it behind her head as she screamed in fear. Then there were lashings. Kept with pride was a thick leather belt from his long-forgotten army uniform. When the mood took him, he'd strike out with it, holding it by the tail so the hard, cold brass belt buckle would swing wildly towards Sandra's bare skin. But if Sandra thought her father's peculiar behaviour was only exhibited through violence, she was wrong. The older she got, the stranger his behaviour would become. He would insist on playing games, not just with young children, but with young women too. Leaping on top of them, he would paw at them, wrestling and laughing as he grabbed at their bodies. Against his gargantuan size, they were powerless to fight back. He'd pin them down and rub his huge hands all over their bodies. When they protested loudly, he'd just laugh off their discomfort. "It's just a game," he chuckled, as though he'd done nothing wrong. Then a new game was invented. He called it Beardy, and it involved pushing his victims to the floor and rubbing his rough beard against their faces until their skin became raw, only letting them free when they screamed hysterically and drew attention to him. Yet still, his protests of "it's just a game" were called out and always forgotten until the next time. As expected, this wasn't a game that took place in the company of his wife, and definitely not in front of other men. Notably, he would choose the victims of this game carefully, only picking women who were either single or married to men he could fight easily. Meanwhile, his relationships with several women went beyond this game of Beardy, as he pursued numerous affairs. But if his peculiar games with young girls and women were kept secret, his affairs weren't, and his long-suffering wife had no choice but to put up with his constant straying from the marital home. Despite the heartache, she tried to see the best in her husband, and was often quoted as saying, "Well, he doesn't gamble his paycheck away, and he doesn't drink." Out of his many affairs, there was one that hurt her deeply. On the day she went into labour and gave birth to a stillborn girl, Alexander was nowhere to be seen, and it was soon discovered he had gone out in the town with one of the nurses, a woman he then continued to have an affair with. Still, despite how much this pained her, she stayed loyal to her husband, although many people urged her to leave him. There were even times when she felt sympathetic toward him and tried to make excuses for his affairs. Her daughter would find out many years after leaving home that her father had been caught up in a scandal as a young teenager when he got an older woman pregnant. What she would soon find out was that this woman was his own aunt. Whether her mother used his experiences as an impressionable teenager with his aunt as an excuse for his later behaviour, we'll never know. But it did appear that she thought at least went part way to explain his indiscretions. Other clues into Alexander's behaviour lie in his upbringing. Born in 1921, he was descended from the Gartshaws of Gartshore, but his poor upbringing in the small rural cottage he was born in did nothing to signify the wealth of his ancestors. The Gartshaws were a controversial family, with roots set deep within the medieval era. But as the centuries passed, their fortune would ebb and flow before disappearing altogether. By the time Alexander was born, the great wealth of the Gartshaws had been whittled away to nothing, and Alexander was born into an impoverished household. This didn't bother his father, who took the loss of fortune with a pinch of salt and good humour, but the same couldn't be said for Alexander. Growing up, he was known to be bitter about the fate of his previously wealthy family, and he often dwelled on what could have been of his life if his family had kept their fortune. He felt cheated out of aristocracy, and he refused to remain quiet about it. He lived as though the world owed him everything, and was known to slip in and out of a rich fantasy world. He lied effortlessly, charming women easily, and never having a shortage of suitors. Despite his constant lying, he was also easy on the eye and held a strong masculine presence. Exceedingly tall, he stood head and shoulders above other men and was like a magnet for young women. When he met the young Mary Brown, she fell for him quickly, and soon they had married and started a family, with the first of their children to survive being Sandra. As Alexander settled into family life, his constant need for sexual gratification only increased, and the objects of his affection grew younger and younger. Rumours were circulated about the things he'd done to young girls in the neighbourhood. Often he would be dressed in blue overalls, pretending to work on something inside his car, a luxurious item at that time that many children relished the chance to take a closer look at. It seemed for many of these children, Alexander repeatedly used the same pattern of behaviour to get their attention. First, he would ask them to approach him to see the car and help out with a small task he needed completed. Then he would ask them to hold a cable. Except when the child put their hand out to grasp it, they were shocked to see it was no cable at all, but Alexander's genitalia, which he had exposed through his overalls. Children tried to tell their parents, but nothing was done. In 1950s Coatbridge, these things were just not discussed, especially by children. Sandra herself said that back then, matters of a sexual nature were just not discussed between parents and their children because of deep shame and embarrassment, and any sort of sexual education was simply not permitted. This meant children lived in ignorance of any sexual matters and had to glean often inaccurate information from each other in the playground or on the street. This enforced ignorance of sex meant children simply did not understand what sexual abuse was, only that it frightened them. Alexander took full advantage of this and knew that children were highly unlikely to tell their parents, and if they were most likely not to be believed. Even if they were believed, parents would hush the whole matter up and refuse to discuss it any further. This resulted in many local children falling victim to Alexander, some who later went on to suffer from serious mental health difficulties, emotional turmoil, and fractured lives. There is no way for certain to know how many children suffered at the hands of Alexander, only that the number is most likely to be staggering. Some of these children did indeed attempt to tell their parents what had happened, only to be severely chastised for talking about such filthy matters. Some were told outright they were liars, while others were given a swift, sharp slap around the back of the head and told to never mention it again. Listening to true crime podcasts is a great way to really get you thinking, but sometimes we all need a break. That's where puzzle game Best Fiends comes in. Skinwalker producer Matt Kay has found the perfect way to relax while editing our episodes is to take a quick break to level up through different puzzles and collect new fiends. He has now gotten to level 60 and has a huge collection of fiends to show for it. Best Fiends keeps things fresh as you find new fiends and the levels get harder as you progress. They also add new levels and characters to play for monthly. Engage your brain with fun puzzles and collect tons of cute characters. Trust me, with over 100 million downloads, this 5-star rated mobile puzzle game is a must play. Download Best Fiends free on the Apple App Store or Google Play. That's friends without the R. Best Fiends. It seemed that Alexander was untouchable, and children in the area were for the taking. But rumours began to circulate among the children, and a few of the more amenable parents, and soon children began to keep their distance from him. Soon, Sandra found that her friends were keeping their distance from her too, but she had no idea why. Her father, though violent and manipulative toward her, did not abuse her sexually in a physical capacity. He was overly crude with her, made highly inappropriate comments, and made her feel uncomfortable, but he never lay a hand on her sexually. As she grew older, she became more confused, and her feelings towards him changed from deep love to deep hate. She stated there were 2 incidents that completely erased any fragments of love she held for him. The first happened when she was 7. Alexander worked as a bus driver, and his depot was situated only a short walk from his home. As it was such a short distance and his lunch break was coming up, Sandra's mother asked her to take his lunchtime sandwiches and find him at the depot. With the sandwiches packed up neatly, Sandra made her way down the road in search of Alexander's bus. Usually, he would be parked in the same spot, so he would be easy to find. As soon as she arrived, she spotted his bus, and when she saw he wasn't behind the wheel, she climbed on board and looked down the aisle. What she saw would stay with her for the rest of her life. On the back seat of the bus was her father, engaging in intercourse with his conductress. Beside him, one of his friends and fellow bus drivers was also engaged in intercourse with his conductress. Alexander yelled at her, "Get the hell out of here," as she dropped the sandwiches. Her first impulse was to run off the bus in search of her nearby aunt's house. She blurted out what happened, and her aunt lovingly pulled her into a hug. What terrified Sandra the most was that she was somehow in trouble, and that her father would be angry and in turn would tell her mother what trouble she was in. Thankfully, her aunt was there to calm her nerves. Her aunt told her it wasn't her fault to soothe her, then going on to quote, "But it's better if you don't say a word to your mum. Your father married a saint when he wed your mum." The incident was never mentioned again. Alexander appeared to forget all about it, and her mother remained none the wiser. The second incident was to be more confusing for the young Sandra, and would quickly dissolve any lasting respect and love she held for her father. Soon after the day in which Sandra stumbled upon him on the bus, he started to behave more lovingly toward his family, and perhaps in an act of guilt, he took it upon himself to take his wife Mary out more frequently on dates. However, as Sandra was still young, a babysitter was needed to look after her and her siblings while their parents went into town. This babysitter took the form of 13-year-old Betty, the daughter of a fellow bus driver in need of some pocket money. Bright, blonde and giggly, she soon became the subject of Alexander's affection, attracting admiring glances from him when his wife was out the room. At first, Sandra enjoyed the young babysitter's company, but when she saw the effect she was having on her father, she grew to loathe her. Yet it became routine for her to pop into the household and look after the children when Alexander took Mary out dancing. Then one Saturday night, Betty didn't turn up. For some reason, Alexander didn't seem to bother too much about this, and reached into his wallet to ceremoniously pull out cash in which to give to his wife. "Take yourself and the kids to the pictures," he'd said. The kids all began jumping up and down excitedly as The Wizard of Oz was playing in the cinema, and they couldn't wait to see it. However, their excitement would soon turn to fear when they arrived at the cinema and watched the film unfold. It would seem Sandra's younger brother, Norman, took an immediate dislike to the film, and once the Wicked Witch of the West appeared on screen, he started screaming out of pure terror. At the sound of hearing his voice, Sandra's other brother, who was still a baby at the time, woke up in his pram and started howling in unison with his brother. Much to Sandra's disappointment, her mother tried her best to hush the boys as she ushered them all out of the cinema. Leaving the cinema much earlier than expected, the four of them traipsed home on the bus. Sandra, running ahead of her mother and brothers, reached the back door of their house first and ran inside quickly. At first, she saw two shapes on the couch. One, the familiar lumbering figure of her father, the other much smaller. Then she froze. In front of her was the sight of her father with a baby girl of about 2, partly undressed and totally confused. As Sandra tried to process what she was seeing, her mother appeared behind her, and that's when all hell broke loose. Immediately, Sandra and her brothers were pushed into a bedroom, and all they could do was listen intently through the door as their parents rowed intensely. Not long after that, just before Christmas arrived in 1956, men arrived at the house and took Alexander away. No one told his children why he was being taken away, and all Sandra knew was that he was there 1 minute and gone the next. Only Sandra's grandmother would explain, even slightly, what had happened to Alexander. All Sandra could do was accept what she was told. It would be 2 decades until Sandra would learn the truth about where her father went and why. In a twist of fate, in 1983, she had been taking part in a community drama festival in the town of Pitlochry, a town located 82 miles north of Glasgow. By pure chance, at one of the shows, a woman approached her with the question, "I remember you, Sandra, and your dad too. He was the tall, handsome bus driver with the dark hair, right? I always felt sorry for him after, well, you know." All Sandra could do was frown and stare at this old acquaintance as she waited for her to elaborate. When she did, Sandra would feel her world fall apart. He wasn't in hospital, the woman explained, but had rather been imprisoned between the years of 1957 and 1959 for the rape of a 13-year-old girl, Sandra's babysitter, Betty. Sandra had already cut ties with him after he had left her mother and started a new family down in Leeds many years previously. To her, Alexander was now nothing but a memory, just a terrible part of her childhood she didn't want to remember. But hearing about this incident out of the blue after so many years shook her to the core. Unfortunately, another revelation about her father was on its way. Sandra's much-loved granny, Jenny, the same grandmother who had told her Alexander had been taken into the hospital, passed away. Family members gathered at her house, and Sandra was on her way there with her now elderly and blind mother in the car beside her. "I have something to tell you," her mother said. "I think you should know your father's here at Grand's." At hearing this, Sandra pressed down on the accelerator and stated, "That's fine, I need to have a word with him on my own." Over the years, she had many questions about why he behaved the way he did in her childhood. Why had he treated her mother so badly? How could she not have known he had been imprisoned for the rape of a child? Soon, she would get her chance to speak with him. As she arrived at her granny Jenny's house, she was surprised to see that her father looked far younger than his 71 years. The tension was thick in the room as she approached him. Other family members around her pretended they were busy with imaginary tasks. Sandra stated, "I'd like to speak with you in private." A few seconds later, she was walking into her grandmother's bedroom with her father in tow. As she closed the door, and looked to him. He said something peculiar that took her aback. Once you're the black sheep, you're always the black sheep. Sandra didn't know what this meant. She looked into his eyes and thought they looked like pieces of grey stone. They were filled with fury, but to her surprise, she felt none of the fear she used to as a child. With her head up, she stared up at him. Immediately she confronted him about what he'd done to her babysitter, Betty. Her father stated, "I thought you knew about that. My father never forgave me." Sandra asked, "Why would your father never forgive you?" "He never forgave me for the Moira Anderson thing." Sandra thought that she'd heard wrong. Silence fell heavily across the room as she stared out the window. Snow was falling heavily outside, and the energy in the room was cold, dark, and intense. "Why would my granddad connect you with Moira Anderson?" she asked him. Unable to look Sandra in the eye, he glanced away. "Because I was the last person to speak to her. I was the last person to see her." He paused as though he couldn't bear to finish the sentence. Tears ran down his face as silence hung thick between them. He finally finished the sentence saying, "I was the last person to see her alive." Sandra couldn't believe what she was hearing. She was hurt, angry, confused, and totally overwhelmed. Yet one thing ran through her head. If her father was a known paedophile who had been convicted for his crimes and been the last person to see Moira alive, then why wasn't he investigated by the police? Immediately, she embarked on a journey to discover why. She set to work investigating her father's involvement on her own, and soon discovered witnesses had seen Alexander as the bus driver when Moira stepped onto his bus on her way to Woolworths. Then things became more confusing. Sandra probed her family for information. Some thought she was crazy, that she shouldn't be dragging up memories from the past, but other family members were more than happy to discuss Alexander's involvement. One conversation with her aunt would give her a piece of information that would complicate things further. It wasn't long after Moira had gone missing when Sandra's mother was sitting at home with Sandra's aunt when Alexander made for the door and declared he was on his way round to the police station to be interviewed about Moira. He stated he'd be back in an hour, casually, as he left the house. This shook Sandra as she realised he was formally interviewed about the missing girl. Or was he? She had to know for certain. Contacting a long-time friend who was also a local police officer, Billy McCloy, she asked if there was any way he could look through official records to see if he was indeed interviewed. She was then promptly put in contact with Detective Inspector Jim McEwen, who was keen to check the records himself. Yet what he found would only muddy the waters. Speaking to Sandra, he pushed a large yellow box file toward her and said, "There is absolutely no trace of an Alexander Garcia being interviewed then or later. No trace." He hadn't been officially interviewed as to the whereabouts of Moira, so why did he tell his wife he was? Sandra grew more confused. It appeared that he was the last person to see her alive, and he had even confessed to this. He'd had previous convictions for abuse against children, and was well known in the area as a paedophile, but for some reason, the police had never identified him as a suspect. Sandra was perplexed as to why they hadn't investigated him, and why had he lied about being interviewed. For Sandra, things would then take a peculiar turn when DI Jim McEwen asked her a very troubling and strange question. He had asked Sandra, "Was your father in the Freemasons?" She had known that he was, but didn't see why that mattered. It wasn't until she discovered his lodge had a membership that comprised of 90% local policemen that she realised the significance. After this, D.I. McEwen and Sandra would set out an investigation that would span many years as she tried to unravel the truth behind her father's involvement in Moira's disappearance. Threads that had long remained tangled and untouched were now pulled free as more information was revealed. Alexander's old bus driving colleagues were forthcoming with their memories of him. One driver, Cliff Harper, was to say he was the type of man who encouraged young girls to frequent the bus at the terminus. This was something supported by other bus drivers, including Tashi Brown, who stated Alex was attracted to wee lassies. He was known to be interfering with them sexually. Meanwhile, another colleague, Pat O'Rourke, would go on to say he interfered with boys and girls. He wasn't fussy. And it was discovered that in 1957, as news of Moira's disappearance spread, so did the rumours that Alexander had done something to her. Just as things were becoming increasingly bizarre for Sandra, events would soon become even stranger. Always seeing herself as open-minded, she agreed to speak to a psychic about Moira's disappearance, a Glaswegian medium named William. He stated, "She seems to be near a quarry where there's a lot of land. It will be almost impossible to find the remains of that child." What is so striking about this incident is that it was immediately taken seriously by police, with D.I. McEwen and colleague Gus Patterson arranging an interview with the psychic William a week later. McEwen would then reveal that he'd had success with a psychic before when investigating the murder of a female taxi driver in Rutherglen, Glasgow. Because of this, he'd be happy to meet William and see exactly what he had to say. Without being given any clues, he was driven around the Cliftonville area of Coatbridge, where McEwen noticed he got instantly animated. She says she trusts him because of his uniform, he blurted out. Why is a bus involved in all of this? I'm clearly picking up that she got on a bus. Soon after this, he asked the two detectives to stop at a nearby pond at a quarry near Cartgill Road. William stepped out of the car, looked around for 3 large chimneys he was being led to by his spirit guide, not realising they had been demolished years previously. Walking up to some nearby marshland, he said he felt Moira was there. Then he promptly turned pale and vomited. Because of William's input into the case, the pond was soon searched for Moira's remains, but nothing was found. Whether she was placed in the pond or nearby marshland will never be known, but interestingly, the quarry is situated near the bus terminal Alexander would have been familiar with. And although Cartgill Road and its surrounding desolate landscape, quarries and marshland was barely known to locals, bus drivers would have known of its whereabouts due to its proximity to the bus terminal. Despite Moira's remains not being found, detectives McEwen and Patterson pursued Alexander for the murder of Moira. He seemed too likely a suspect. Not only was he a convicted paedophile, but he admitted to police investigators that he had picked her up on that night, telling police she had stepped off his bus on Main Street in the centre of Coatbridge at the time she vanished. With the evidence mounting against Alexander, it would appear his days as a free man were numbered. Jim McEwen and his men arrested Alexander Garcia, who was still living in Leeds, then released him on bail. The Scottish Crown Prosecution Service instructed McEwen to continue his investigations. It would appear that justice for Moira was eventually materialising. At the same time, Alexander was also charged with 5 counts of lewd and libidinous behaviour against 4 of Sandra's cousins, women who were young children when they were abused by him decades previously. But just when it seemed as though things were coming to a head and Alexander was finally going to be publicly revealed as Moira's killer, McEwen and his men investigating the case were dealt a blow. Procurator Fiscal David Griffiths insisted no further proceedings were to take place. He stated, "You can't call this a murder. It's a missing persons case. There is no murder without a body." Just like that, Sandra and Jim McEwen hit a brick wall. But Sandra, being as tenacious as ever, would not give up hope. She worked tirelessly for years to see her father convicted, but it would be 2012 by the time Moira Anderson's case would be upgraded officially to a murder inquiry when it was taken up by the newly formed cold case unit. Unfortunately, by this time, Alexander Garcia had been dead for 6 years. Although the investigation into Moira's disappearance may have had a slow start, it gained momentum after Sandra wrote a book titled Where There Is Evil, detailing how she came to suspect her father was the killer and her subsequent work in investigating her suspicions. In 2013, information reached the cold case unit that Moira's remains could have been concealed in a grave within Old Monkland Cemetery in Coatbridge. However, when the grave was exhumed, nothing was found. Again in 2015, further information reached the cold case unit, stating her remains could be in another local spot, the Monkland Canal in Coatbridge, but again, no remains were discovered. In total, Police Scotland identified 5 individual sites where Moira's remains could have been located, and during excavations, numerous bones were unearthed. Through forensic analysis, these were revealed to be nothing more than animal bones. Alexander Garcia may have died without facing prosecution, but information is still forthcoming about his involvement in Moira's murder. Not long after his death, convicted paedophile Alexander Keel approached the Daily Record with a 26-page dossier compiled by another convicted paedophile and friend of Garcia, James Gallagher, shortly before his death in 1999. For Gallagher, this dossier was a little black book containing the names of members of a paedophile ring named the Untouchables. This ring was said to include high-ranking members of Parliament, judges, as well as Alexander Garcia and Dunblane mass murderer Thomas Hamilton. In the book, Gallagher stated that he helped capture and abuse Moira, and that Garcia had sedated the young child before abusing her and leaving her on the bus. It was here that she perished, not by the hands of Garcia, but from the cold. Yet, there was another name within the book that is likely to raise eyebrows. Serial killer Fred West was also identified as a member of this group, and as far-fetched as this sounds, there is evidence that he lived in Coatbridge, albeit after Moira disappeared. Fred West's first wife, Rena, hailed from Coatbridge, and in a peculiar coincidence, was an acquaintance of Sandra growing up. Fred West didn't settle in Coatbridge until the early 60s. However, he was acquainted with 2 local paedophiles who were linked by police to Moira's disappearance. Many people have theorised that his compulsion to kill started earlier than before current evidence would suggest. And in recent years, 4 women have been identified as being possible victims of West within the Glasgow area. It is currently believed they were buried in his allotment in Glasgow's south side, but this has since been covered by the construction of the M8 section of motorway. We will never know for certain if West did murder women within the Glasgow area, nor can we confirm he had any involvement in Moira's disappearance. We also can't confirm that he was a member of the Untouchables paedophile ring. If he was, the implications of this would be monumental. Not only would he have been linked to Alexander Garcia and the death of Moira Anderson, but he would have also been acquainted with members of Parliament and high-ranking officials within the legal system. It is a difficult notion to believe, especially as the dossier compiled by Gallagher was discredited as nothing but a work of fiction by police officials. As time passes, we are no nearer to securing closure in the case of Moira Anderson. It would seem that with the more time that passes, more questions arise. For many, including Sandra, Alexander Garcia remains the prime suspect, but regretfully, we will never know if he truly was the one to take Moira's life, although it appears more than likely he was. In 2015, a Police Scotland spokesman admitted that if Garcia was alive today, he would certainly have been charged with Moira's murder. Since the book Where There Is Evil was published, Sandra founded the Moira Anderson Foundation, which aims to provide support for victims of childhood sexual assault, which has been nominated for numerous awards, including Charity of the Year. She has also completed a second book, titled No Secret Better Kept, which is currently awaiting release. As of 2020, the Moira Anderson case is still very much alive and active, and her family, who have suffered for decades, are still yearning for answers to her disappearance. Information as to her whereabouts are constantly forthcoming, with the latest piece of intelligence being received by Police Scotland as recently as February of this year. As more details of Alexander Garcia's legacy of abuse come to light, more victims have come forward. One of these being Moira's own sister, Janet. She claims that when she was on her lunch break from school, she was approached by Garcia in his black Austin car. He had asked her to look at something underneath the bonnet, and when she approached him, he had groped her. She instantly ran back to school, where she alerted a teacher. After this, the school advised pupils to only leave the premises in pairs. Speaking from her home in Australia in 2017, she told the BBC, "Luckily, I was in an area I could get away. It was broad daylight. Unfortunately, Moira was trapped on his bus." Currently, Alexander Garcia has been implicated in the abuse of 122 children, although it is assumed the number is much higher. As the investigation into Moira's murder is still ongoing, any witnesses are encouraged to come forward. "I still think of her every day," says her sister Janet. "All we want is closure."
Thanks everybody for listening. That was a really phenomenal episode, and one which really shook me personally. It was also the first ever Skinwalker episode not written by myself or GS. It was actually written by our newest contributor and now member of the team, Astrid. Astrid is an author by day and a huge true crime fan from Glasgow by every time. If you were as blown away by the standard of her writing and research as we were, you can book her insane writing talent from her Upwork page, which we've attached a link to in the show notes. Thanks everybody.
Here at Skinwalker, we always like to keep you up to date with new and interesting podcasts we find, and this past week we have found one we can't stop listening to. True Crime Couple is a true crime podcast hosted by Kay and John. They discuss a new crime in each episode and give some great insight into criminal behaviour alongside great research. And the best part is, they have a huge catalogue of episodes waiting for you to listen to. So if you're looking for another podcast to add to your subscribe list, then give True Crime Couple a listen wherever you get your podcasts.
Introducing Xfinity's breakthrough Wi-Fi speed, now faster than a gig. And with X1, you get access to live TV and top streaming apps. Upgrade today. Go online, call 1-800-XFINITY or visit a store today. Restrictions apply. Actual speeds vary, not guaranteed. Requires compatible X-Fi gateway.